It's my pleasure today to talk to Jarrad Redekopp. Jarrad is an instructor at Camerson College. His most recent publication is an intervention entitled Why Runa in the recent International Studies Perspective Forum on Differing About Difference, Relational IR from around the world, which is an absolutely fascinating forum, and I recommend anybody who's interested in Jarrad's work to have a look at that forum. He's published a piece with Tamara Trounsel on disrupting anthropocentrism through relationality, and he co-wrote 2 ethnographic articles with Todd Swanson, which you can find in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. And Jarrad's recently published Review of International Studies article is entitled Against Ontological Capture, Drawing Lessons from Amazonian Kichwa Relationality. And it's part of a forthcoming special issue, which we're really excited about, on pluriversal relationality between theory and practice. And Jarrad's article offers what he calls an experiment in theorizing within or across the space of ontological disagreement that's at stake in relations between states and indigenous peoples in the Americas. And he looks both at the kind of transformative potential and the ontological capture of indigenous thinking. So hopefully we'll hear more about that in this discussion. So welcome, Jarrad. And I wonder if I could just start with a sort of question about, what led you to write about the topic? How did you become interested in relational ontologies, relations between states and indigenous peoples in the Americas?
Yeah, well, I think, I think like many of us, as I come to political theorizing and thinking about, international relations and so on, it's an attempt at some level to understand the milieu in which I'm grounded in some sense. So, I grew up in Canada and I live in Canada, which is, a place that's, founded on colonialism and capitalist extractivism and so on. And so, trying to understand the dynamics of that milieu and how that works. But then also, it's a place in which, indigenous people, are here and around. And so the kind of stuff that's in the air, and, certainly in when I going to grad school and growing up here and so on, included, peers and colleagues and so on who are indigenous and have, very interesting things to say that are quite different from the sorts of things you might otherwise hear in sort of a mainstream political science discussion or something like that. And I kind of come out of a milieu that sort of blends critical theory with anthropology and so on. And then, I think that I really got a chance to deepen that going to Ecuador over a number of years. I started doing that in my PhD research and doing research fieldwork with Amazonian Kichwa people, and I really owe a debt to Todd Swanson, who really helped me and another cohort of grad students to work on learning the Kichwa language, and so that we could work in it and interview. And so in and through that process, you start to get a sense of a very different way of thinking. And to me, as I try and make puzzle over the things that surprise me in that, usually the kind of key insight that helps me sort of puzzle through it is that it's got to do with relationality and relational understandings of existence. So in many ways, this is just an attempt to try and kind of think through some of the implications and provocations and so on that have come out of that set of experiences for me.
Yeah, and I think one of the kind of key things about this article is the way you bring sort of anthropological insights to political theory and kind of relate them to one another and make that a productive encounter. I'm wondering if you can tell us sort of what's the argument, the kind of sort of central sort of points that you make in the article?
Yeah, so I mean, I at some level, it's an attempt to kind of engage and build on some of the interventions that we'd associate with maybe the ontological turn in sort of interdisciplinary, but also kind of rooted in anthropology right now. That this idea that to kind of understand what's going on in the kinds of things indigenous people have to say, and often in opposition to states and state projects and so on. You have to understand that as grounded in different ontologies, different fundamental assumptions about the nature and structure of existence, but kind of the understanding that part of what ontology does is it allows for a kind of cumulative co-creation of a world, a sense of being in the world that ultimately is different from what I grew up kind of doing. So ultimately what I'm trying to do is kind of make a case, first of all, that I think that's right, that you need to kind of start with ontology in some sense, and then draw out some of the provocations that I think are there in terms of, how if one starts to think alongside relational assumptions about existence and so on, how does that then open grounds for a critique of kind of dominant ways of thinking and being and so on. I try and show what some of those are, and also kind of show with some ethnographic examples and so on, what my kind of argument is based in. But then I also try and show how that those provocations are usually things that get covered over in the way we often talk about Indigenous politics, particularly from a non-Indigenous kind of outsider vantage point, which is ultimately my vantage point. So, yeah.
You start out by talking about it being an experiment with theorizing within or across a space of ontological disagreement, which I found to be a kind of fascinating sort of I don't want to say methodological principle, but a kind of ethos, right? You want to kind of I mean, I like particularly that you emphasize the sort of experimental nature of your thinking, but also the way in which it kind of tracks a series of ontological disagreements, of kind of questions about the relations between ways of being. I wonder if you could explain a little bit more to kind of everybody who's watching, sort of what you mean by this kind of experimental approach of theorizing across a space of ontological disagreement.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is I think that often the ways that we do, critical theorizing or kind of critical thought about politics and so on, it's often grounded in sets of assumptions that I mean, there are differences and so on if we go into the Western tradition and so on. I don't want to suggest that there aren't, but from the point of view of once you've spent some time thinking with, for example, Indigenous thought from the Americas, you do really get a sense of, there's some really different vantage points that are in here that wouldn't have otherwise occurred to me. And so, part of what I'm trying to do is sort of think through some of the ways that in learning something of a competence in thinking with and kind of alongside, Indigenous relational ontologies and so on, how, what kinds of provocations does that raise for someone kind of grounded in a Western education and so on, and so a set of kind of habituated ontological assumptions that comes along with that, and trying to think those through in terms of political implications and a reading of politics and so on.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at that, those kind of other ways of understanding ontology and so on, I wonder if you could say a little bit about, because the article tells us some fascinating kind of things about the way in which sort of Indigenous ways of knowing, particularly Amazonian Kichwa kind of ways of knowing, sort of challenge typical sort of Western anthropocentric understandings of the world. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how those, how Kichwa, for example, how they challenge these kind of anthropocentric ontologies.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they do so, I think, very, very profoundly. If we want to think about anthropocentrism, we usually think about that in terms of, reflecting a particular understanding of human beings as separate from nature, and also as exceptional, as having certain kinds of faculties that differentiate us from other species and so on. And that part of what I try and show is how that's predicated on a certain kind of history of thought, certain kinds of assumptions that often kind of go unnoticed because we often don't entertain other possibilities. In Kichwa thought, instead, part of what you get is an idea of other species, of species difference that's quite different. So it's not a sort of taxonomic difference within a sort of singular field of knowability from a kind of universal vantage point or something like that. There's this idea that other species are transformed people like us, or Runa like us. But part of what that means is that their transformation nonetheless creates a barrier of opacity and a difficulty of understanding and empathizing and so on. And so there's a kind of space of opens a different kind of interactional horizon, I think, where other species are sort of liminally imaginable, and yet they also partially exclude us. And so one of the things I think is interesting there is that if, for example, we think about IR, a core concern of IR as being, how do you relate with others across boundaries of difference or something like that. that's something you already see happening in relations across species, or with other species, but also relationships of other species to other species. As a result of that, you get a sense of there are principles for relating well in a good way with difference, that are already kind of imminent and present and modeled by the land and so on. And then that becomes a source of law and a source for thinking about, it's a continuum of relations then, with the difference that we would normally think of as political in terms of being other human beings or something like that. So it really, it gets rid of this hierarchical, vertical sort of cosmology in this way, and opens up a very different interactional field, and space for thinking about political relation.
Yeah, I mean, the article really kind of outlines, I think, this kind of relationality, very, very well. But you also talk about the dangers of what you call ontological capture. Can you explain what that is, what the kind of danger is that you see there, and also, what can be done to avoid that capture? What can be done to kind of think with or in relation to these indigenous knowledges without, slipping into this ontological capture?
Yeah, so I mean, as I'm thinking about ontological capture, I'm really thinking about it first of all from the point of view of it's a diagnosis from, like, self-consciously from my kind of position in a relation to indigenous knowledge and so on, which is that of an outsider, that of I'm a settler within Canada and so on. So it's really a concern I have with the way people like me tend to engage often indigenous thought and indigenous politics when indigenous people, for example, have things to say about resource projects or things like that. So part of what I think it's about is the way in which we have a tendency to kind of cover over these more radical and interesting provocations that I'm trying to sort of draw out through the course of the article, by assimilating indigenous thought to the kind of to our ontology, to our assumptions about existence, our categories, and so on. So for instance, when we think about what's at stake in indigenous rights, for example, language about rights to territory or hunting and so on, we can there's a way of reading that at kind of face value, as though what rights was about is what it means from the Western tradition and from that particular set of definitions and so on, rather than, for example, a space of translation that actually, if you look at what indigenous people are talking about often in those cases, it's very different from the kinds of things you would just think if you're thinking about rights, which might set us up for again a kind of anthropocentric relationship to resources or something like that. So part of what I suggest is ultimately, like, the course of the article is in some sense a kind of experiment in doing something other than ontological capture in some sense. So paying heed to these moments of translation and to political spaces as moments of translation, spaces of translation. I think cultivating a degree of competence in thinking alongside relational ontology, allows that kind of difference to come out and be engaged in a more fruitful way. So that's part of what I think we can do in terms of avoiding ontological capture in that sense.
Fantastic. I mean, I think that's really interesting, kind of that sense that that ontological capture is not complete, because a lot of critical theory thinks about other forms of knowledge as already always being co-opted, but you kind of show the ways in which it's a danger, but it's not a fait accompli. It's not always the case. So I think that's a really fascinating part of the article. I wondered if you could just say something a little bit about, some of people watching, some of the people reading may not be familiar with either sort of relational kind of ontologies or, sort of indigenous politics. I'm wondering if you can tell me, how this article speaks to sort of IR more broadly. You hinted at it in your kind of discussion about sort of, relations of difference. But I wondered if there were kind of one or two things you wanted IR scholars who maybe don't work in this area to take away from this conversation, what would they be?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's maybe interesting resonances, I think, with, first of all, with people don't have to be working in relation to indigenous knowledges and so on in the Americas, but there's all kinds of other relational traditions around the world. And that's one of the things I think is kind of interesting about the doing work with the sort of doing IR differently crowd, who are also part of the special issue here, is that many of those people are rooted in other traditions in Asia and so on. So there are interesting cross resonances there in terms of how does one engage difference in a different and more productive maybe kind of way. That avoids some of the more usual dynamics. I think that we're also at a time when an urge to rethink how we think about the possibilities of political and relational life, and in relation in particular to non-human beings and so on, is a pressing concern that for a lot of people coming from a lot of different theoretical vantage points and so on. And so I think that the part of what emerges from this kind of engagement that I'm trying to do here is also principles and possibilities of thinking that can resonate maybe in interesting and provocative ways with people coming from post-humanism or there's other relational work grounded in the Western tradition, for example. And I think that there's stimulating conversation that can happen there, in terms of rethinking how it's possible to be in the world in some sense.
Yeah, fantastic. So you finished this article, it's published. We're going to be online with review. What's next for your research? What are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, well, I'm at the moment working I'm teaching in Indigenous studies again at the college this term, so that's occupying a lot of my energies at the moment. But I'm also writing. I'm working on an article that does something similar. Actually, it connects with a lot of the arguments here, but tries to think. Provocations from Kichwa thinking through in conversation with Nietzschean thought and a sort of diagnosis, a cultural diagnosis of nihilism, and how if our orientation point is Kichwa relationality, that allows for a different kind of story around nihilism and sort of alternative possibilities. That's one thing I'm working on. The dream is always turning the dissertation into a book, so we'll see.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think it shouldn't just be a dream, right? I mean, it's a long-term project, but hopefully we'll get there. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Jarrad. You'll be able to find the link to the article below the video, and I do strongly recommend reading it. I think it's got some fantastic sort of anthropological insights that really speak to a kind of wide range of relational questions in IR. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.